Well, you might want to have a copy of Psalm 13 handy as we consider where we're up to with the coronavirus and with God, looking at this psalm. Well, we're now several weeks into our lockdown journey, and it seems to me that we've travelled a long way in a very short time. A journey we embarked on without our permission being sought, a journey we were not consulted about, and a journey we are realising with its many curses and maybe a few blessings. Today I want to ask, how does Psalm 13 help us to travel what is rapidly becoming a disturbing journey? The psalm starts off with a great complaint. How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul? How long shall this enemy be exalted over me? Well, some have been enlivened by the lockdown and its challenge, pleased to have the free time, gardening, walking, doing some reading. There are some other folk who've been enlivened by getting the NHS ready for the oncoming onslaught of all these patients. And some also too excited by the move to home working. But the feeling I get now is that the shine has gone. Even the sun has stopped shining. And maybe we are starting to complain about the lockdown. And not only are people suffering because of the lockdown, they were suffering before that, many folk. Some are coping with an elderly or sick relative at home or in a care home. Some have suffered tragic bereavement, and what they need right now is a hug from a friend. Some are suffering from depression, cancer or other illnesses. Also too, unemployment, desperate loneliness. Some people are facing bankruptcy or even the threat of becoming homeless. For some, their domestic nightmare has become magnified as they're now locked in with their abuser. And to cap it all, there are hints that some social restrictions could last until the end of the year. And we're starting to moan. And without realising it, we are starting to mimic Psalm 13. How long, O Lord? How long will this go on for us? How long will you forget us? How long will we have to suffer? How long will this virus be an enemy against us? But as good Christians, we feel guilty about moaning because that's not what good Christian people do. A while back I heard about a woman whose young adult daughter was very severely disabled. This young woman couldn't move any of her limbs. She couldn't talk or see. Maybe she could hear. So she couldn't care for herself, feed herself, and was continually in pain. It was a dire situation. Each Sunday, her mother faithfully wheeled her up to the church for her to receive the sacrament. No doubt after being up for another night, looking after her and caring for her. Their life was about struggle and suffering. One day, she asked her priest, "Am I a bad person if I sometimes think, I wish this was all over?" Her priest replied, "You would be a pitiful person if you did not think this sometimes." Like in this psalm, There was no denial about the situation, no cover-up, no pretending, no glossing things over, no "I'm sure it'll get better" or "I'm sure God has got a plan." That sort of talk ran out for her years ago. The complaint was, in effect, "How long?" And it was a complaint. The mother could no longer deny her suffering or her daughter's suffering. There was no pretense of getting by left. Brutal honesty came out of her mouth when talking that day to her priest. And maybe we're finding it harder to be cheery and carry on as if everything's okay, really. Maybe that's wearing a bit thin now. And maybe candour and frank speaking are slowly becoming our vocabulary too. As we read this psalm and watch the news, we see that rage and bewilderment are becoming the experience of more and more people now. As they and we mope around in this land of dismay and uncertainty, this terrible limbo land, as sometimes I call it. Terror and sighing is all around, and anxiety stalks many folk throughout the night. And we probably say, and if this goes on long enough, it will even reach people like us, we who live in privilege, entitlement and good fortune. I was in a church recently, I shan't say where it was, where a young man sat in his electric wheelchair. He too was severely disabled. During the service, people responded to words of knowledge and went forward for healing for their unseen pains in their back or their head. He remained unhealed among the congregation, his sickness obvious and extreme. I wondered whether he raged and if he lived in bewilderment, because I think he should. This psalm cries out, "How long, O Lord, for something is terribly wrong." And it is clear who is to blame. It's the Lord. Notice in this psalm, it is never assumed that the psalmist is guilty or has failed. They ran out of self-accusation energy years before. It is God. It is God who is absent. Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? The crises and the pain that haunts us each day cannot be separated from our ongoing relationship with God, or sometimes lack of it. And eventually we get to a point where we can no longer dress things up in polite language or in nice church speak, and we blurt it out in a complaint. Not long after I was ordained, I remember hearing about a young teenage brother and sister whose mother had suddenly died and left them bereft. And they handled their grief in quite different ways. The girl made a card, and in this card it expressed her thanksgiving to God for who her mother was and all the gifts that her mother brought to her. The young man, he went and baked a cake. He then took it to the hospital. He went into the chapel and he threw the cake at the cross on the altar. That was how he dealt with his grief. That was his complaint. Rage and complaint still has a place in our tradition, and sometimes it's not pretty at all. Psalm 13 is a complaint against God and a call for God to pull God's finger out. The charge has been made, the evidence of God's misdeeds laid out, and then at the end of verse 4, there is silence. Because there's nothing more to say. This dangerous speech has come to an end. We've all been in relationships where something has gone wrong. A hurtful thing said, a trust betrayed, a kindness abused. I don't know. You know when it all goes wrong. And the silence of these ruptures seem to be eternal and laden with heavy emotion. They feel sometimes irreparable and irredeemable and therefore terminal. Everything goes silent. We're left wondering what might happen next, or is it all over? In this psalm, we do not know how long the wait was. We don't know what happened in the wait. We don't know how full of anger and tension the silence was. I don't know where your rage and disappointment lie when you're in difficult times, or what's happening in your life at the moment despite the virus, or how you negotiate them, or negotiate with them even. I don't know how your COVID-19 weariness coincides with the other pressing issues in your life which are demanding your attention. I don't know if the residue of your complaint is spent in resentment, in unbearable pain, or in an ongoing angry reality. The psalm, though, I think, bids us to make our complaint and wait. To wait for the but that comes then in verse 5. So finally in verse 5 we arrive at, but I trusted in your steadfast love. This but is our beacon of hope. It is evidence of a new reality that follows our present limbo imprisonment. That resurrection does follow dying. So the psalmist says in verse 5 and 6, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt generously with me. In this psalm, eventually rage and the wearisomeness came to an end, and it came to an end with a word, and the word was but. But I trusted in your steadfast love. We are not told, as I said, how long the psalmist sat there in her madness and obsession, like Job, who sat looking out on the rubble of his life. We are not told how long her rage boiled silently within her as she waited for a reply. We are certainly not told that she easily moved to faith and trust in God, naively saying, oh, it's okay, really. That's not there. For her accusation was serious and potentially was lethal to the relationship. She too, like Job, was on the verge of saying, curse God and die. No matter. In the silence of the wait, the great but was finally arrived at. She didn't minimise the complaint, as the complaint is left there clearly recorded in the psalm. This did not disqualify the candour, for it's here for all to see. However, the but led to the hope, not despite the darkness and the difficulty and the suffering, but through the darkness, and even because of the darkness. So today we stand in this no place, COVID place, or wherever you are at this time, going nowhere and maybe knowing nothing. And we hold ourselves in the silence with the pain, the loneliness, the fear, the numbness, the weariness, and the absence. And we wait for our but to lighten our path. For then we will see the hope of newness. For as day follows night, our but will eventually follow our long wait. Amen.